What happens when a devoted wife is publicly humiliated by her husband's mistress? Do you think she crumbles in defeat? Think again. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a tale of calculated revenge and glorious transformation. You're about to witness how a woman mocked for her simple clothes orchestrates a takedown so epic, so perfectly executed that it brings a millionaire to his knees. She doesn't just get even, she redefines the entire game. Stay tuned, because the moment a seemingly meek wife arrives in haute couture and the cameras start flashing, everything changes. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York glittered with the kind of incandescent light that only old money and new ambition could generate. It was the annual Heart of the City Gala, a cornerstone event for Manhattan's philanthropic elite. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto tables laden with floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, self-satisfied hum of the city's most powerful players. Catherine Ashworth moved through it all with the quiet grace she'd honed over 15 years of marriage to Richard Ashworth. At 42, she was still a classically beautiful woman, with serene blue eyes and honey blonde hair pinned into a simple, elegant chignon. Tonight she wore a deep sapphire blue silk dress by Carolina Herrera. It was understated tasteful and at least 3 seasons old. In a sea of sequins, feathers, and daring décolletage, Catherine was a portrait of timeless, almost forgettable elegance. She knew this, and on most nights she was comfortable with it. Tonight, however, felt different. Her husband Richard was a shark in a Savile Row suit. He wasn't just in the room, he owned it. His real estate empire, Ashworth Holdings, had its steel and glass tentacles wrapped around half the city's skyline. He was charismatic, with a booming laugh that commanded attention and a smile that could disarm his fiercest competitors. But for the past year, that smile had rarely been directed at Catherine. She saw him across the room holding court near the silent auction displays. And next to him, practically fused to his side, was Zara. Zara Flynn was everything Catherine was not. She was 26, with a mane of fiery red hair that cascaded over her shoulders and a body poured into a shimmering gold-sequined dress that left little to the imagination. She was a social media influencer, a reality TV starlet, a woman whose entire career was built on being seen. Her laughter was loud and throaty, a stark contrast to the polite titters of the other women. She was Richard's mistress, a fact that was perhaps the worst-kept secret in their social circle. Catherine's hand tightened on her small clutch. She had agreed to come tonight for the sake of appearances, a phrase that had become the unofficial motto of their marriage. Richard had insisted. "It's for the children's hospital, Ev. We have to show a united front," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished marble, while his eyes were already distant, likely on his phone texting Zara. She took a fortifying sip of her champagne and began the slow, familiar waltz of a society wife moving from one conversation circle to another, exchanging pleasantries with people she'd known for years. "Catherine, you look lovely," said Margaret Vanderbilt, her own gown a riot of Oscar de la Renta ruffles. "As do you, Margaret," Catherine replied with a genuine smile. She actually liked Margaret. But her gaze kept being pulled back to Richard and Zara. They were now standing with a group that included some of Richard's most important investors, including the formidable Japanese tycoon, Mr. Tanaka. Richard was gesturing expansively, telling a story, and Zara was clinging to his arm, looking up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. It was a performance, and a sickeningly good one. Catherine felt a familiar pang, a dull, aching mix of humiliation and sorrow. It wasn't the affair itself that wounded her most deeply anymore. The initial shock had long since curdled into a kind of chronic pain. It was the brazenness of it. Richard didn't just have a mistress, he flaunted her. He was daring Catherine to challenge him to make a scene, knowing she was too private, too dignified to do so. As if sensing her attention, Zara's eyes, sharp and green as a cat's, flicked across the room and met Catherine's. A slow, smug smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She whispered something in Richard's ear. He glanced over at Catherine, his expression momentarily unreadable, before turning back to his audience. Later, as Catherine was speaking with the gala's chairwoman, she overheard Zara's voice, sharp and carrying from a nearby group. "Can you believe it? It's like she just stepped out of a 2010 catalogue," Zara said, her voice dripping with condescension. A few sycophantic giggles followed. "I mean, I get that she's of a certain generation, but this is the heart of the city gala. Not a suburban book club meeting. Richard has such an image to maintain. It's a shame his wife doesn't seem to care." The words struck Catherine with physical force. It wasn't just an insult. It was a public stripping of her value, a declaration that she was no longer fit for the world she had helped Richard build. The woman who had hosted countless dinners for his clients, who had remembered the names of their children and their favorite wines, who had stood by him through financial crises and corporate battles, was now being dismissed as a dowdy relic by the woman sleeping in her husband's bed. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to turn to walk over there and slap the smug look off Zara's face. She wanted to scream at Richard for allowing this, for creating the environment where such disrespect could flourish. But she didn't. Instead, she excused herself with a calm murmur and walked towards the terrace, her posture ramrod straight. The cool night air was a relief. Below Central Park was a dark, sprawling mystery, its edges fringed with the lights of the city. She gripped the cold stone balustrade, her knuckles white. She had been a fool. Her dignity, her quiet suffering, her belief in maintaining a united front, what had it gotten her? It had been interpreted not as strength, but as weakness, as permission. Richard found her there 10 minutes later. "There you are," he said, his tone breezy, as if he hadn't just stood by while his mistress mocked her. "Tanaka is about to leave. I want us to say goodbye, together." Catherine turned to face him, her eyes cold. "I heard what she said, Richard." He had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable. He loosened his tie. "Zara can be a little much. She's young. She doesn't understand the nuances of our world." "The nuances?" Catherine's voice was dangerously low. "The nuance where you allow your mistress to publicly humiliate your wife while you're trying to close a deal. Is that in the manual?" "Oh, for God's sake, Catherine, don't be so dramatic." He snapped, his patience always thin with her lately evaporating. "It was a silly comment about a dress. A dress, is that what this is about? If you want a new dress, go buy one. Buy 10. Buy the whole damn store. You know I don't care about the money." That was it. That was the core of his dismissal. He thought this was about a dress. He thought her pain, her humiliation, her entire identity could be placated with a shopping trip. He was no longer seeing her as a partner, or even as a person. She was just another one of his assets, one that had apparently depreciated over time. "You're right," she said, her voice suddenly calm clear and utterly devoid of the emotion he expected. "It is a silly comment about a dress." Richard looked at her, surprised by her sudden capitulation. He expected tears, recriminations, another draining argument, that would go nowhere. Her placid agreement unnerved him. "Good," he said cautiously. "So let's go see Tanaka off." As she walked back into the glittering ballroom at his side, presenting the perfect picture of the supportive wife, something inside Catherine shifted. The pain didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened into a subtle, single, sharp point of purpose. Richard was right. It wasn't about the dress. It was about everything the dress represented, and he in his arrogance had just handed her the very weapon she needed. He thought she was a relic from a bygone era. He and his flashy, loud, modern mistress thought her style of quiet strength was obsolete. They were about to find out how wrong they were. As she smiled graciously at Mr. Tanaka, she made a silent vow. She would not leave Richard. Not yet. That would be too easy, too predictable. No, she would not be the tragic wife who faded into obscurity. She would become the woman Richard couldn't afford to lose, and the woman Zara could never hope to be. The game had been set, and Catherine Ashworth, a woman of a certain generation, was about to rewrite the rules. The days following the gala were a study in deceptive tranquility. On the surface, nothing in the Ashworths' cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment changed. Richard was busy consumed by the final negotiations of the Tanaka deal. He came home late, smelling faintly of Zara's heady perfume, and left early, his mind already on spreadsheets and zoning laws. He and Catherine moved around each other with the practiced, distant choreography of a long married couple who had run out of things to say. He mistook her silence for acquiescence, her calm for defeat. It was a fatal miscalculation. For Catherine, the apartment had transformed from a home into a headquarters. The humiliation at the gala had not broken her. It had forged her. The dull ache of betrayal had been replaced by the cold, clear fire of resolve. She was no longer a victim in her own life story. She was the architect of its next chapter. Her first move was not to a divorce lawyer, but to her laptop. She didn't research asset division or custody arrangements. Instead, she spent hours in her late father's old study, a room Richard never entered, surrounded by his leather-bound books on finance and art history. Her father, a respected investment banker, had taught her more than just how to appreciate a Monet. He had taught her how to read a balance sheet, and more importantly, how to understand that true power rarely shouts. Catherine began by meticulously untangling her own finances from Richard's labyrinthian empire. Over the years, she had paid little attention, allowing him and his army of accountants to manage everything. Now she scrutinized every statement, every trust, every investment vehicle that bore her name. She discovered that thanks to a prescient prenuptial agreement her father had insisted upon, and several inheritances she had received, she was independently wealthier than Richard probably remembered. She was not just a dependent, she was a silent partner. Her second step was a phone call, not to a friend for a tearful lunch, but to a number she hadn't dialed in over a decade. "Antoine," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "It's Catherine. Catherine Ashworth." On the other end of the line, in a chic Parisian atelier, Antoine Dubois, one of the world's most revered and reclusive couturiers, paused in his sketching. He remembered Catherine, not as the wife of a brash American tycoon, but as the daughter of his old friend, a young woman with an innate, quiet understanding of style that was a rarity. "Catherine," he said, his voice warm with surprise. "Ma chérie, it has been too long. What can I do for you?" "I need a dress, Antoine," she said simply. "No, I need more than a dress. I need a suit of armor." Intrigued, Antoine listened as Catherine explained not the sordid details of her husband's affair, but the essence of her objective. She didn't speak of revenge or humiliation. She spoke of reclamation, of presence, of making a statement without uttering a single word. She wasn't a woman scorned. She was a patron with a vision. It was a language Antoine understood perfectly. "I am not interested in what is in season," Catherine concluded. "I am interested in what is eternal." "Leave it with me," Antoine said. A creative spark ignited. "I have an idea. Something transformative." He told her he would fly to New York for a private consultation the following week. The final piece of her initial strategy was the most crucial. Catherine knew that a new dress, no matter how spectacular, would just be a fleeting spectacle without the right narrative. She needed to control the story. For this, she turned to the best. She secured a meeting with Serena Vance, the head of Vance Communications, a PR firm so exclusive and so effective that they were known in media circles as the Queen Makers. Serena was a legend, sharp, impeccably dressed, and notoriously selective about her clientele. She didn't handle scandals, she built legacies. They met in a discreet tea lounge at the Carlisle Hotel. Serena, with her severe black bob and piercing gaze, listened intently as Catherine laid out her situation. Again, Catherine was strategic. She painted a picture not of a marriage in crisis, but of a woman at a crossroads. "For 15 years I have been Mrs. Richard Ashworth," Catherine explained, her hands resting calmly on her lap. "I have supported his ambitions, raised our children, and managed our social obligations. I have been a partner in building the Ashworth name. Now I feel it's time to cultivate my own identity, to step into the light on my own terms." She mentioned her desire to revive her family's dormant charitable foundation, focusing on arts education for underprivileged children, a cause she was genuinely passionate about. She was leveraging her own history, her own name, the one she had before Ashworth. Serena watched her, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Most women who came to her were in a panic, desperate to salvage a reputation. Catherine was calm, composed, and thinking 3 moves ahead. She wasn't asking Serena to clean up a mess. She was inviting her to build a monument. "And Richard," Serena asked, her voice neutral, "what is his role in this evolution?" "Richard is as always focused on his business," Catherine said with a small, enigmatic smile. "He believes my world is very small. He has no idea of the scale of my plans. He thinks my greatest ambition is redecorating the summer house in the Hamptons." Serena's lips curved into a rare, knowing smile. "Men like your husband often suffer from a failure of imagination when it comes to their wives," she observed. "They see the woman they married 20 years ago, not the woman she has become. So you want to launch your foundation, and you want to do it in a way that is impossible to ignore." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. "The annual Modern Masters Gala at the Met is in 6 weeks." Serena said, her mind already working. "It is the most photographed event of the spring season. More press than the Heart of the City Gala by a factor of 10. Everyone who is anyone in art, finance, and media will be there. That will be our stage." A plan began to form between them, a carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers and strategic leaks. They would seed stories in the right columns, not about the affair, but about Catherine Ashworth's re-emergence. Stories about the revival of her family's philanthropic legacy, about her passion for art, about her quiet influence. They would build her up piece by piece, creating a narrative so compelling that by the time she walked onto that red carpet, she wouldn't just be Richard Ashworth's wife. She would be a power in her own right. When Catherine returned to the apartment that afternoon, Richard was home early for once. He was on the phone, pacing in the living room. "No, Zara, you can't come," he was saying, his voice a low, frustrated growl. "The Met Gala is a different beast. It's A-list only. Corporate tables. My table is for investors. No, it's not about you. It's about business." Catherine walked past him, a ghost in her own home. He barely glanced at her. He was too busy managing the expectations of his mistress, completely oblivious to the quiet revolution being plotted just a few feet away. He was fighting the wrong battle, watching the wrong front. He was so focused on the noisy, glittering distraction of Zara that he failed to notice the silent tectonic shift happening right under his feet. The wife he took for granted was quietly sharpening her weapons, assembling her allies, and preparing to step onto a stage he couldn't control. The 6 weeks leading up to the Met Gala were a masterclass in subtlety. While Richard was consumed by the final frantic stages of his deal with Tanaka, a deal Catherine knew that was becoming more complicated than he let on, she was quietly building her coalition. This was not a war to be won with shouting matches in their marble-floored foyer, but with discreet lunches, rekindled friendships, and the slow, steady drip of information into the right channels. Her first and most important alliance was with a woman named Beatrice Dubois, the widow of a French diplomat and a revered figure in the art world. Beatrice was Antoine the couturier's cousin, a woman who moved with the quiet authority of someone who had seen empires rise and fall over cocktails. She had been a dear friend of Catherine's mother, and Catherine had always admired her wisdom and her encyclopedic knowledge of New York society. They met at La Grenouille, a bastion of old-world charm that felt a world away from the trendy transient spots Zara frequented. Over glasses of Sancerre, Catherine laid out the full story, holding nothing back. She spoke of Richard's affair, Zara's public mockery, and her husband's profound underestimation of her. Beatrice listened, her elegantly wrinkled face betraying nothing but thoughtful concentration. When Catherine finished, she reached across the table and patted her hand. "My dear," she said, her voice a low, cultured murmur. "Men like Richard Ashworth build their worlds on the foundations their wives provide. They become so accustomed to the stability, they forget the foundation is there, until it cracks." She took a sip of her wine. "So you are not merely redecorating the house. You are rebuilding it on your own terms. I approve." Beatrice's approval was more than a comfort. It was a key. She opened doors that had been closed to Catherine for years. Doors Catherine hadn't even realized she wanted to walk through. Suddenly, Catherine was co-hosting a private viewing at a Chelsea gallery, with Beatrice being reintroduced to museum curators artists, and most importantly the city's old money philanthropists, the very people whose respect Richard craved but could never fully command. They saw in Catherine not Richard's appendage, but the daughter of a man they had respected, and a woman of substance in her own right. They spoke of her revived foundation, the Langley Foundation for the Arts, with genuine interest. Her passion was authentic, her knowledge of art history deep. She wasn't a bored wife looking for a hobby. She was a serious person with a serious mission. Meanwhile, Serena Vance and her team were working their magic in the press. There were no salacious leaks about the affair. That would have been too crude, too Zara-like. Instead, a different narrative began to take shape. A small item appeared in the New York Times style section about the resurgence of quiet luxury and intellectual philanthropy, subtly contrasting it with the louder, more performative charity of the new money crowd. Catherine's name was mentioned as a prime example of the former. A piece in Town & Country Online profiled the legacy givers, children of prominent families who were reviving their parents' charitable work. The Langley Foundation was featured prominently with a quote from Catherine about her father's belief that art is the conscience of a city. There was no picture of her, just her words, which gave them more weight. These whispers were a form of psychological warfare. They didn't attack Richard or Zara directly. They simply created a world, a standard of elegance and purpose, from which Zara, by her very nature, was excluded. Zara, who documented her every expensive meal and sponsored vacation on Instagram, was the embodiment of the performative culture the article subtly decried. Richard, when he noticed it all, was pleased. "Good press for the family," he commented one morning, glancing at a mention of the Langley Foundation in a society column. "Glad you're keeping busy, Ev." He was so blinded by his own ego that he saw her activities as a charming, harmless extension of his own brand building, like a new, tastefully decorated wing of his corporate headquarters. He failed to see it was a separate building entirely with its own foundation and its own source of power. Zara, however, was not so complacent. She saw the shift, and it infuriated her. Her world was built on attention, and suddenly a sliver of that attention was being diverted to the boring wife. "What is this stuff I keep seeing about Catherine's foundation?" she demanded of Richard one night in her sleek, minimalist Tribeca loft, a loft paid for by an LLC connected to Ashworth Holdings. "She's making it sound like she's the next Brooke Astor. It's embarrassing. People are going to think you can't control your own wife." "It's nothing, baby," Richard soothed, distracted by a dozen other business pressures. "It's a little project to keep her happy. It means nothing, but it did mean something." Zara's insecurity began to make her sloppy. She became louder, more demanding. She posted increasingly lavish photos online, a new diamond bracelet, a weekend trip to St. Bart's on a private jet, in a desperate attempt to reassert her status as the woman at the center of Richard's world. But in the new context Serena Vance had created, her post started to look less glamorous and more grasping. The comments section, once a stream of fawning praise, began to see a few dissenting voices. "This is so tacky. Some people have more money than class." Catherine's final and perhaps most critical alliance was forged in the world Richard respected most: finance. She had lunch with Michael Chen, a rival developer and a man Richard had bested in a particularly nasty bidding war 5 years prior. They had never been friends, but they shared a mutual acquaintance in Beatrice Dubois, who arranged the meeting. Catherine didn't ask Michael for money or business advice. She simply guided the conversation to the Tanaka deal. She mentioned offhandedly that Richard seemed under a lot of pressure, that the financing seemed more complex than usual. Michael, a shrewd and observant man, picked up on the cue. "Richard is a gambler," he said, stirring his espresso. "He over-leveraged to get the financing for that project. He's counting on Tanaka not only to invest, but to bring in their banking partners. If that deal falls through, he'll be dangerously exposed." Catherine simply nodded, filing the information away. She didn't need to do anything with it. She just needed to know it. Knowledge she was rediscovering was the ultimate form of power. On the eve of the Met Gala, Antoine arrived from Paris with a team and several large, heavily insured garment bags. He set up in one of the guest suites of the Ashworth apartment, which he turned into a private fitting room. When Catherine saw the dress for the first time, she gasped. It wasn't a dress. It was a masterpiece. It was not loud or flashy. It didn't scream for attention. It commanded it. It was a column of celestial midnight blue silk, so dark it was almost black, that seemed to absorb the light around it. But the artistry was in the details. Thousands of tiny hand-sewn platinum beads formed a breathtaking, abstract constellation that cascaded down one shoulder and across the bodice, pooling at her hip, before scattering down the length of the gown. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly unique. It was a suit of armor forged from silk and starlight. "It is you, chérie," Antoine said softly. Strong, serene, with a universe of fire inside. As she stood before the mirror, she saw not the woman who had cried on the terrace of the Pierre Hotel. She saw her father's daughter. She saw a patron of the arts. She saw the head of the Langley Foundation. She saw a woman who had quietly gathered her forces, built her alliances, and was now finally ready for the main event. Richard was still trying to figure out how to tell Zara she couldn't come to the party. He had no idea his wife was about to become the party. The air outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art crackled with an electric, chaotic energy. It was a symphony of shouting paparazzi, the basso thrum of black SUVs, and the high-pitched squeals of fans pressed against police barricades. The theme of this year's Met Gala was celestial bodies, and the red carpet, a vast, sweeping staircase, was already a galaxy of fashion's brightest, boldest stars. It was a spectacle of epic proportions, and into this maelstrom, Richard Ashworth arrived looking smug and triumphant. The Tanaka deal, after weeks of tense, exhausting negotiations, had finally been signed that morning. To Richard, this gala was not just a social obligation, it was a victory lap. He had his investors at his table, a multi-billion-dollar project secured, and he had successfully managed to handle Zara, who was currently pouting on a consolation prize trip to Monaco paid for by him. He stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo, ready to soak in the adulation he felt was his due. His wife Catherine was arriving separately. He'd barely seen her all day, assuming she was engaged in some last-minute fussing over her hair and makeup. He did his obligatory turn on the red carpet, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with a city councilman, and basking in the glow of his success. He was holding court midway up the stairs, accepting congratulations from a rival developer when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. It began as a murmur at the base of the staircase, a ripple of excitement that quickly turned into a roar. The chaotic barrage of flashes from the photographers, which had been diffused across a dozen different celebrities, suddenly coalesced, focusing with laser-like intensity on a single point. Every camera, every lens, every eye turned towards a new arrival. Richard squinted, annoyed at having his spotlight stolen. He saw a car pull up a discreet black Maybach, and from it emerged a woman. For a moment his brain failed to process what he was seeing. It was Catherine. But it was not the Catherine he knew. The woman on the red carpet was not the quiet, tastefully dressed wife he took for granted. This was a celestial event in human form. The Antoine Dubois gown was more than a dress. It was a statement of power. The midnight silk drank the harsh light of the flashbulbs and reflected it back as a soft, ethereal glow. The platinum beadwork glittered like a newly discovered nebula, catching the light with every graceful movement. Her hair, usually in a simple chignon, was swept up in an intricate, regal style that highlighted the elegant column of her neck. On her ears were not her usual pearl studs, but a pair of stunning diamond drop earrings that looked like captured starlight. She didn't hurry up the stairs. She moved with a serene, unassailable confidence, pausing as the photographers screamed her name. "Catherine! To your left, Catherine!" "Look here," they weren't shouting, "Mrs. Ashworth." They were shouting her name. Richard stood, frozen, a half-empty champagne flute in his hand. His investors, Mr. Tanaka included, fell silent beside him. Their eyes were all fixed on Catherine. He could feel their surprise, their admiration, their reassessment. But the dress was only the opening salvo. As Catherine reached the top of the stairs, she was met not just by the customary greeters, but by Serena Vance, who seamlessly guided her towards a waiting group of reporters from Vogue, the New York Times, and the Associated Press, the media heavyweights. This was no coincidence. This was an ambush. "Catherine, you look absolutely breathtaking," said a well-known fashion journalist. "Antoine Dubois, of course. He hasn't dressed an American in years. How did you convince him?" Catherine smiled a calm, radiant smile that was broadcast on screens around the world. "Antoine is an old family friend," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He understood the spirit of what I wanted to achieve tonight. This isn't just about fashion. It's about art, and the power of art to transform." Richard watched a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This was not his quiet, unassuming Catherine. This was a stranger, a polished, articulate, formidable stranger. Then came the master stroke. A reporter from the Times stepped forward. "Catherine, there have been whispers for weeks. Can you confirm the rumors about the Langley Foundation?" This was the moment. This was the culmination of 6 weeks of planning of quiet alliances and strategic whispers. "I can," Catherine said, her gaze sweeping over the cameras, seemingly oblivious to her husband, standing just 20 feet away. "I am thrilled to formally announce tonight that after years of dormancy, I am relaunching my family's foundation. The Langley Foundation for the Arts is dedicated to funding arts education in New York City's most underserved communities." She continued hitting the key messages Serena Vance had drilled into her. "In a world focused on building higher and faster, we often forget to nurture the soul of our city. The Langley Foundation will ensure that the next generation of artists, dreamers, and innovators has the opportunity to flourish." Then came the twist that landed like a body blow to Richard. "And I'm not doing it alone," Catherine announced. She gestured to the side and stepping forward. To join her were Beatrice Dubois, Michael Chen, and most shockingly, Mrs. Tanaka, a woman known for her own significant philanthropic work in Japan. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Michael Chen, his sworn rival, and Mrs. Tanaka. Her presence was an implicit and very public endorsement. He saw the look on Mr. Tanaka's face, a mixture of surprise and deep respect directed entirely at Catherine. In that moment, Richard ceased to be the sole power player in his own deal. His wife had just flanked him, aligning herself with his rival and the family of his most important new partner. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously. The story was no longer just Richard Ashworth closes Tanaka deal. It was now Catherine Ashworth launches major philanthropic foundation with a powerhouse board upstaging her own husband at the Met Gala. Someone finally thrust a microphone in Richard's face. "Richard, what a surprise. Your wife's new foundation is the talk of the gala. What are your thoughts on this incredible announcement?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely blindsided. This wasn't a little project. This was a coup executed with military precision on the most public stage imaginable. He looked at Catherine, who finally met his gaze from across the sea of reporters. There was no anger in her eyes, no vindictive triumph. There was only a cool, calm strength he had never seen before. It was the look of a woman who had finally realized her own worth, a woman who no longer needed his permission or his approval. He felt a wave of dizziness. He saw the smirks on the faces of his competitors. He saw the calculating look in Mr. Tanaka's eyes. He had spent the day celebrating a business victory, believing he was the king of his universe. But as the cameras flashed and the world watched, he realized the devastating truth. His wife, the woman he had dismissed and allowed his mistress to mock, had just built her own kingdom. And she had built it right in the center of his drawing, a new map of power, one where he was no longer the undisputed ruler. The foundation of his world had not just cracked, it had shattered. The fallout from the Met Gala was not a loud explosion, but a series of quiet, devastating shockwaves that dismantled Richard Ashworth's world from the inside out. It began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the East River. Richard, awake after a restless night, saw the first alerts ping on his phone. The online editions of the city's major publications were live, and their verdict was unanimous. His hard-won Tanaka deal, the supposed crowning achievement of his year, was relegated to a dense, jargon-filled column on the business page. But the front pages of the style and society sections, the digital and print real estate that shaped the opinions of the world he lived in, were a different story. They were a shrine to Catherine. Vogue ran a multi-photo spread under the headline, "Catherine Ashworth's Celestial Coup, More Than a Dress, a Declaration." The article deconstructed her look not just as a fashion choice, but as a political statement. In a sea of borrowed glamour and fleeting trends, the journalist wrote, "Catherine Ashworth in bespoke Antoine Dubois reminded us of the enduring power of personal history and quiet purpose. She didn't just wear a dress, she inhabited an idea." The New York Times was even more impactful. The rebirth of a philanthropist, Langley Foundation takes center stage as Catherine Ashworth steps from the shadows. The piece lauded her initiative, framing it as a necessary antidote to the transactional charity of the new money elite. It detailed the impressive board she had assembled, the respected art world doyenne Beatrice Dubois, the rival magnate Michael Chen, and the internationally esteemed Mrs. Tanaka. The narrative Serena Vance had so carefully constructed had become gospel overnight. Catherine was no longer an accessory. She was the main event. In her sun-drenched Monaco hotel suite, Zara Flynn woke up to a reality that felt like a personal attack. Her phone was buzzing incessantly, but not with the fawning praise she was used to. It was a deluge of tags, mentions, and DMs, all pointing her to the same galling story, Catherine's triumph. A venomous rage, hot and acidic, filled her. She had been exiled, sent away with a diamond bracelet as a pacifier, so that this relic could have her moment. Scrambling, she went on the offensive. She frantically posted a series of Instagram stories, a pouting selfie on the deck of a yacht, the crystal-clear water, a backdrop to her manufactured ennui, a close-up of a newly purchased Hermès handbag placed artfully on a cafe table, a boomerang video of clinking champagne glasses with a faceless male friend she'd hired for the day. Her captions were a desperate volley for relevance. "Living my best life, #unbothered. Some girls get titles, others get treasures. Monaco life." But her timing could not have been worse. For the first time, the world was in fact unbothered by Zara Flynn. Her desperate displays of wealth, which just weeks ago might have been seen as aspirational, now looked childish and crass against the backdrop of Catherine's grand, meaningful gesture. The comments section, once her personal echo chamber of adoration, became a firing squad. "While you're posting selfies, his wife is actually changing the world. This is so tacky. Read the room." Class versus trash, and we all know which one you are. That hashed unbothered tag seems very bothered. The final nail in the coffin of her public persona came not from a troll, but from her agent. The call came in the afternoon. "Zara," he said, his voice tight and devoid of its usual sycophancy. "That luxury watch campaign we were closing, they're pulling the offer." "What? Why?" She shrieked, the champagne glass trembling in her hand. "Their brand is about timeless elegance, Zara. They feel your current public perception is not aligned with that message. They're going in a different direction." The line went dead, leaving Zara in a silent, gilded cage of her own making. Her brand, built on being the glittering center of attention, had been instantly and irrevocably devalued. She was no longer the scandalous, exciting other woman. She was just the tacky mistress of a man whose wife had just become a legend. For Richard, the consequences were more immediate and far more severe. He walked into a follow-up lunch with Mr. Tanaka and his team, expecting to finalize logistics. Instead, he found Catherine already seated at the table, deep in conversation with Mrs. Tanaka. Mr. Tanaka had specifically requested her presence. The atmosphere was palpably different. The talk was not of concrete and steel, but of art and legacy. Mr. Tanaka turned to Catherine. "My wife was telling me about your foundation's focus on preserving traditional art forms among the youth. It is a subject dear to my heart." Catherine responded with an erudite point about the loss of artisanal skills in the digital age, her knowledge fluent and her passion genuine. Richard could only sit there, a silent, useless observer, at his own meeting. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he watched the scene unfold. He had always presented himself as the lone wolf, the singular genius behind his empire. Now Tanaka and his other investors saw that his greatest asset was the one he had neglected and disrespected. They saw Catherine not as a potential liability in a messy divorce, but as a stabilizing force, a woman of integrity. His own character, by extension, was now under review. His reckless affair was no longer a private matter. It was a glaring business risk. "Your wife is a formidable woman, Ashworth's son," Tanaka said to Richard later, as they were leaving his words a perfectly courteous dagger. "A company's strength is not just in its balance sheet, but in the character of its leadership. All of its leadership." The social shunning was swift and brutal. It wasn't a formal decree, but 1,000 tiny cuts. He called his regular golf partner a man he'd known for 20 years, only to be met with a flimsy, unbelievable excuse about a bad back. Invitations to private dinners and weekend getaways simply stopped arriving. The wives of his friends and business partners, who had once tolerated Zara's presence with strained smiles, now greeted him with icy politeness before turning away. They sided unequivocally with Catherine. She had not asked them to. She didn't have to. Her actions had spoken for her, and they had all heard the message Catherine Ashworth was a woman to be respected. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt powerless. He tried to confront Catherine in their apartment that evening. The space, once a monument to his success, now felt like her sovereign territory. "What was that, Catherine?" he demanded, trying to summon his old booming authority. But his voice was hollow, a ghost in the vast living room. "What the hell was that whole spectacle?" Catherine looked up from a proposal she was reviewing for the foundation, her expression as placid as a deep lake. "That all," she said, her voice even and cool, "was me reminding you and everyone else who I am. I am not just your wife, Richard. I am the daughter of Robert Langley. I am a partner in this life we built. And I will not be dismissed or disrespected. Not by you, and certainly not by your mistress. You went behind my back. You allied with my rival, Michael Chen." He spat his face, turning blotchy. I built a board for my foundation. She corrected him gently, the correction itself a display of power. Michael Chen, despite your history, understands the importance of civic duty. Mrs. Tanaka is passionate about arts education. Their presence lends credibility to a cause I believe in. It was never about you, Richard. You simply assumed the world revolves around you. That has always been your problem. He stared at her, finally seeing the depth of his folly. He had poked a bear he thought was a kitten. He had mocked her clothes, her quietness, her dignity, failing to understand that those were the very sources of her strength. He had thought power was loud, flashy, and gold-sequined. He had been wrong. Power was a couture gown that whispered a strategic plan executed in silence and a network of allies bound by mutual respect, not by money. The final crushing blow came a week later. Richard was in his office staring at spreadsheets that suddenly seemed meaningless when his private line rang. It was David Merrill, the senior vice president from the bank financing the Tanaka project. Richard, David began, his tone uncomfortably formal. I'm calling about the final tranche of funding for the Ashworth Tower. The board had a meeting this morning. There are some concerns. Concerns, Richard repeated, his stomach clenching. The deal is signed. Tanaka is in. Yes, we know. But our commitment is contingent on our confidence in the project's leadership. Richard, the board is concerned about the stability of your personal leadership in light of the recent public developments. The press has been extensive. The implication was as clear as it was catastrophic. The bank and the world saw Catherine as the stable one. Without her implicitly by his side, Richard himself looked like a bad investment. He was facing financial ruin, not because of a market crash, but because he had failed to value his wife. He found her in the study, a place he now entered with the trepidation of a petitioner approaching a throne. The room was filled with the late afternoon sun, and she was bathed in it, an icon of calm authority. They're going to pull my funding, Catherine, he said, his voice stripped of all its usual bluster. He looked defeated, smaller a man, deflated. Because of you. Catherine put down her pen and folded her hands on the antique desk. No, Richard, she said, her voice not unkind, but firm as steel. It's because of you. It's because of your choices. Your arrogance, your profound lack of judgment, and your belief that the only person in this marriage who mattered was the one in the mirror. He sank into a chair opposite her, the leather sighing under his weight. What do you want, Ev? He whispered, using the old familiar diminutive. It sounded foreign, unearned. A divorce, half of everything. All of it. Catherine considered him for a long moment. She could ruin him completely. She had the power, the leverage, and the justification to do so. But she had never been motivated by pure revenge. Her goal had been reclamation, not destruction. I want respect, Richard, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. And I want a new arrangement. Our marriage as we knew it is over. That is non-negotiable. From now on, we are business partners. You will run your company, and I will run my foundation. We will maintain a public front of civility for the sake of our children and our remaining business interests. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Your affair with Zara Flynn will end. Immediately and permanently. You will provide a generous but final settlement, the terms of which my lawyer will draft. It will include an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She will disappear from our lives and from the public eye. If I see so much as a single cryptic social media post from her, that settlement becomes void. Am I clear?" He could only nod his eyes wide. "We will live in this house as cohabitants, but not as a couple. We will attend major functions together when required as partners in the Ashworth-Langley enterprise, but our private lives will be entirely separate. These are my terms. They are not negotiable." Richard looked at the woman before him, poised, powerful, and in complete control, and he knew he had no choice. He had lost. He had been so busy looking down on his wife, so confident in her meekness, that he never saw her rise above him. He nodded slowly, the architect of a crumbling empire brought to his knees not by a market downturn or a corporate raider, but by the quiet, indomitable will of the woman whose dress he had let his mistress laugh at. Catherine Ashworth had not just won the battle. She had redrawn the entire map of their world, and in this new world she was and would always be queen. Catherine's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about quiet confidence, strategic thinking, and knowing your own infinite worth. She transformed humiliation into empowerment and taught everyone who underestimated her a lesson they would never forget. What did you think of Catherine's epic comeback? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone so completely turned the tables on their detractors? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by this story of drama and triumph, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama.